In today's episode of Today in World War II, March 27th, the Yugoslav resistance overthrows its government. Hitler postpones the invasion of Soviet Union because of the situation in the Baltics. Uh, the Nazis send their first convoy of Jews to Auschwitz from France. A Dutch resistance group finds an ingenious way to resist. uh, a Japanese hero that nobody knows about prevents a biological attack against the United States. The Soviets capture Gdynia in Poland. Let's get started. Okay, so we've been following the situation in Yugoslavia. We know that Prince Paul, the Yugoslavian government, had agreed to go in shoulder to shoulder with Hitler and his Nazi his Nazi government, if you want to put it that way. And as I mentioned yesterday, there was quite a lot of resistance. A lot of ministers resigned. Lots of protests in the streets. Well, the army took over today. The Yugoslavian army. It was led by General Dusan Simovic and other anti-German officers. They overthrew the government in Yugoslavia, and they put Prince Regent Paul with King Peter II back in power. And their whole idea was to back out of the tripartite pact, which was the government, was Bulgaria, Romania, and Yugoslavia that would be on German side. And of course, Hitler needed them to shore up his southwest flank for his incoming or invasion of the Soviet Union. Well, that I can you can imagine old Hitler did not like that very much. He was not very good about forgiving and forgetting, and the least bit of resistance he needed to crush. And so he ordered the invasion of Yugoslavia today. So that was interesting. Now, on March 27, 1942, the Gestapo, the SS, they had their unholy duty to try to wipe out the entire Jewish race, at least the ones they get their hands on, and they were turning their attention to uh, France. So today, the very first train convoy, left Paris and on its way to Auschwitz to start the deportation and outright murder and ethnic cleansing of the Jews. Uh, what can I say? Just one thing you need to understand about history, folks, is that the focus of the Nazis was on the Jews. They took a a group that was not considered its own, wasn't considered German, Aryan, right? It made them the bad guys, made them the enemy, and desensitized the population to the point where everybody pretty much supported this, or at least looked the other way, which was in effect that was supporting. So fascism and Nazism does not mean anti-Semitism per se. It's an overall philosophy of you single out a vulnerable minority group in your country and you make them the enemy. Let's look what's going on in America right now. Trans, homosexuals, migrant workers, you know, non-white. Face it, but there's categories, right? They go after a certain group first, and then they take care of that, and they go on, and the whole goal is they want to have their own caste of, uh, you know, your own people, and then everybody else are slaves or less than. Okay, that's what fascism is. So don't think, well, okay, they're not really going after the Jews here, so we shouldn't be worried. No, it's about the tendency, the philosophy. You see what's happening. You look at it from a long view, not from just, well, it's not exactly like it was in World War II, so we don't have to worry about it. No, you worry about the tendencies. You worry about the movement and how they're doing things. Okay. On March 27, 1943, a resistance group attacked the Amsterdam Population Registry and destroyed all the data that could be used to detect false identification cards. Why was that so important? Well, remember, you can't walk around if you're in the resistance, you can't have your full name because and who you are because then the Gestapo will go after your family and you have to be an entity of yourself. And logically speaking, if you want to continue to resist the Nazi regime, you better make sure you can be stealthy. And by doing this, they were able to destroy the data that could help the Nazis detect whether an identity card was correct or not correct. So what they did was they dressed up as police officers, they overpowered the cards, and they poured this combustible liquid on all the papers in the filing cabinets. Then they placed their explosives and they left. And so when the explosive device went off, of course, now that all that paperwork was, soaked with combustible material, then it all just went boosh, of course, and it collapsed the building. And it's interesting because this was not just a Dutch thing. The Norwegian resistance did something very similar. So obviously, this was being coordinated by the Brits, SOE, the Special Operations Executive. But yes, that was the Dutch had a very good resistance group. And listen, they were fighting as best they could. And of course, they were always going to take more losses than successes. If you're in an occupying country of a totalitarian regime, that's going to happen. But these types of victories were very important, and they were great, very good for the morale as well. That they showed the citizens were watching, seeing that they just didn't roll over and say do whatever you want. Okay, on March 27, 1945, a a heroic Japanese officer actually saved America from a proposal to attack us with biological weapons on the West Coast. His name was Yoshihiro Umezu, and he was in the army, and he rejected the proposal by the Japanese to deliver, like I said, biological weapons by submarine-borne aircraft, and they were going to target a city on the West Coast. He said he wouldn't do it for ethical reasons. Wow. Think about that. An ethical Japanese officer. That you didn't get that very often, considering all the barbarity that they performed in the war. But without the Army support, this Operation PX, would be canceled. But think about that, right? Even back then, there was a way to introduce biological or non-traditional weapons of mass destruction. People think that COVID was built in a lab. Well, the Japanese were planning something very similar in 1945, and thanks to God that this army officer Imezu stopped it. And finally, on March 27, 1945, Soviets captured Gdynia in occupied Poland. This was a hugely important port on the Baltic Sea. It was also the center of shipbuilding. And even now, the Germans, of course, they never left anything intact. They blew pretty much everything up, sabotaged it, damaged it. The fighting, of course, caused a lot of collateral damage. And the Germans also blocked the harbor entrance with their famous battle cruiser Gneisenau, the one that had wreaked havoc on so many merchant ships in 1939, 40, 41, and so on and so forth. Well, that was sunk by specifically in to block the harbor, and the battle cruiser's guns continued to shell the Soviets until they were knocked out. So that was a busy day, March 27th. Thank you for being here. I can't wait to get you a video tomorrow.